somatosensory system. So this is body sense from skin, and it turns out from muscle. Muscle is going to be a sensory organ as well as a motor organ. So the skin, information about touch, pressure, temperature, pain, is divided into, well, we have touch, pressure. Let's talk about the modalities first. The modalities of somatosensation. Touch and pressure kind of go together. It turns out pain and temperature, hot, cold, go together. And then there's proprioception, body position. So 5 somatosensory modalities: touch, pressure, pain, temperature, body position. We're going to have those 5 modalities are going to go into 3 different neural pathways to the brain. Remember, we sense it and then we process the information. So there's going to be the touch, pressure, vibration pathway. There's going to be the pain and temperature pathway, which is also going to include itch. We're not going to talk too much about itch, but it's an important sensation. And then the proprioception, body position. 3 different pathways from the body to the brain. The body is divided into dermatomes. Derma as in skin, tome as in, tome means slice. Slices of the skin. Each section of the skin, each dermatome, is determined by where the neuron enters the spinal cord. So remember, I'm going to go to the next slide for a moment. This is anterior. This is an anterior view of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is embedded in the spinal canal of the vertebra, the spine. The input is going to enter the spinal cord between the bones. And where it enters, what level it enters on, creates a dermatome. So for example, information from your heel goes up a neuron, enters the spinal cord in the sacral region. That's one. Information from your belly button enters your spinal cord at the T10 level, right here. Information from your neck, I should say neck right here, C2, enters your spinal cord at the cervical, level 2. Remember, I'm not going to ask you to remember that detailed information. I do want you to know these in order: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral. That's something I asked you to learn before, and I'm going to ask you to keep that knowledge. I'm not going to ask you to know how many are in each. And I'm not going to ask you to know that the belly button goes to the T10. But I might give you a problem. In fact, I do give you a problem that asks you to use this kind of information. So this information, this figure, is going to be an important part of solving at least one of the problems on the problem set. Now remember, in the problem set I give you a problem related to spinal cord injury. If we have a spinal cord injury here, it's going to disrupt information getting to the brain from below that area. But information from above that area is not going to be disrupted. So for example, if we had a lumbar injury, we could imagine that there's going to be sensory information loss in the legs, but not sensory information loss from the arms. Because the information from the arms enter above the break, the damage. Okay, so you're going to use that information to solve problems on the problem set. Now, there's also sidedness. So there's level information and there's sidedness information. This is the left, so it's always important to get oriented. You're looking at someone else's spine, front, left, right. So even though this is your left, this is my right. So my hint on if I give you a problem that asks you to know left and right, is just write L and R on your image so that you remember, oh, this is R, not L. So if there was injury, so there can be injuries either in the nerve or the gray matter or the white matter. Concept. The gray matter here is going to be where the input is processed, and the white matter is where the axons are going to go up. That's the white matter here is the myelinated axons that are going to take information from this dermatome and send it to the brain. So when I show you this, information from your belly button's right on the midline, so it's probably entering both the left and the right side of the spine, right? Nerves are going both left and right into my spinal cord at the T10 level. And then axons are going up both the left and the right. We're going to talk about those pathways in a minute. Information from my right finger is entering the spinal cord. This is the right side. Information from my right finger is entering the spinal cord on the right side of at the C7 level. Okay? You're going to use this in the problem set. There are receptors for the different modalities of touch, pressure, vibration. We have a whole bunch of them. I do not want you to memorize, everybody remember, not memorize the names of these structures. Do not, this is reference for future use if you become a sensory physiologist or a physician. There are receptors in the skin, in the subdermal layers of the skin, that are specialized for different modalities. So we have names and we have modalities. Do not memorize the names, do not memorize which modality is which, but do memorize that there are modalities for touch and pressure. There are modalities for vibration and deep pressure. Okay? So different receptors are tuned to different modalities. These are, they're different. They look different under a microscope of the skin. These are receptors that are detecting touch or vibration or pressure. How do they do that? There are things called stretch-activated ion channels. Ion channels that are actually that are opened by stretch of the membrane that they're in. So when I poke at my fingertip, I'm stretching some membrane, opening some stretch-activated channels in, say, let's just say Meissner's corpuscle, opening some channels in Meissner's corpuscle. Those channels are cation selected, and now you know where we're going. Opening cation selected channels, sodium influx, depolarization, threshold, action potentials, propagation of the nerve. So it starts, but this is what I want you to know, even though it's not on the slide, is that touch and pressure start with stretch-activated ion channels in these various corpuscles of the skin. Pain and temperature are different They aren't in these corpuscles. Corpuscle just means little body, Latin for little body. Yeah. There are these so-called free nerve endings that are not in these bodies. They're really just, they innervate the skin, and they detect pain and temperature. So if I were to, I didn't bring a needle, but if I wouldn't do anything if I did, but if I were to prick my finger with a needle, that would trigger, first there would be touch and pressure. I would detect touch and pressure, but I would also detect pain from different nerve endings. So I do not want you to know the names of the corpuscles or the modalities that they work on, but I do want you to know that the corpuscles are for touch, pressure, vibration, heat pressure, etc. And the free nerve endings are for pain and temperature. The detector in the corpuscle, like I said, is stretch-activated ion channels. The detectors in the pain pathway are different receptors that are not stretch-activated. They are more chemically activated. So when we give our skin a painful response, we are releasing chemicals like ATP from cells that are being damaged, and acid from cells that are being damaged. And we're releasing some neuromodulators. And so the things that are detecting pain are really detecting chemicals. They're detecting acid. They're detecting ATP released from the damaged cells. And they are detecting either a chemical or a temperature. So here's an interesting fact. The receptor in the free nerve endings that detects painful heat is also the receptor that detects hot pepper. This is the chemical that is active in chili peppers. So when you taste hot peppers, you are actually activating the hot pathway. And you may have already sensed that if you eat hot peppers and the temperature is hot, it makes things taste hot. Spicy food tastes hot because it's activating the same pathway. We detect cold by a related receptor that detects cold and menthol. If you put menthol on your skin, it feels cold because it's activating the same receptor. Menthol also has a very distinctive odor, so it kind of has a taste. But we're not talking about taste and we're not talking about odor. We're talking about the fact that the menthol receptor, and the thing that Ben Gay is activating, is detecting cold. When you rub Ben Gay on your skin and it feels cold, the skin's not getting cold. You're rubbing it. It's skin temperature. But it feels cold because it's activating the cold receptor. Menthol is activating the cold receptor. Capsaicin, hot peppers, are activating the hot receptor. I am not going to ask you to memorize this string of letters and numbers, but I do want you to know that there are different receptors. There is a cold receptor, there is a hot receptor, there is a cold receptor, there is an ATP receptor, and there is an acid receptor. All of these activate the free nerve endings and trigger action potentials to your brain that say, oh, that hurts. Okay? I'm not going to ask you the names of these modulators. I'm not going to ask you to know the names of the receptors. I'm going to ask you to know the modalities and the fact that there are different receptors. There's an interesting story about this cold receptor. The Coca-Cola company had a lot of research. They spent millions of dollars trying to find a chemical that would activate the cold receptor, like menthol, but did not have any odor or taste. So an odorless, tasteless activator of the cold receptor. You can imagine why this would be a good thing for the Coca-Cola company to find. You could have a drink at room temperature and it would taste cold. It never worked. They could never find a compound that activated the cold receptor but didn't have some nasty taste. There is a cultural thing here. In the West, we, in America, Europe, we talk about the capsaicin receptor, the receptor for hot pepper, as the receptor is a painful hot receptor. So we talk about that being part of the pain pathway. But there are cultures for which the capsaicin receptor is an integral part of taste. So when we get to taste, we're going to have to address this issue of cultural differences between what tastes good and what tastes good and what doesn't taste good. For some people, probably for most of us now, even in our culture, hot peppers taste pretty good if they're in the right food. But we still, in Western physiology, call this receptor part of the pain pathway, painful heat. A cultural hegemony by the West. I don't defend it, I'm just putting it out there. Let's talk about proprioception. So we're transitioning from skin to muscle. So muscle is how we move. It turns out that muscle also has sensory receptors embedded in it. So here's a muscle fiber, here's a muscle. Let's just say this is the biceps. Relaxed and stretched, contracted and flexing the other. Biceps. Embedded in the biceps are a structure called muscle spindles. So the muscle fiber is doing the work of contracting. The muscle spindles are muscle cells in the sense that they also contract, so they don't go slack when these muscles are actually doing the work. But these muscle spindles have detectors, have sensory detectors that detect the stretch and the tension on the muscle. So when my muscle is extended, it was relaxed and extended, I'm getting a certain pattern of information from the muscle spindles to my brain, and my brain has learned to interpret that, oh, your elbow is completely extended. When I contract, the muscle spindles are sending a different kind of information. Less stretch, less action tension, less stimulus. My brain has learned to interpret that as flexed. What is the receptor in these sensory cells of the muscle spindle? These neurons. What kind of channel do you suppose these are that are detecting stretch, extension of the muscle, or flexion of the muscle? What kind of channels? Same, I've mentioned them previously. Stretch activated ion channels. More stretch of the membrane of this cell, more channel activity, more depolarization, more action potentials. That information then is interpreted by my brain to say my muscle is extended. Fewer action potentials, less stretch, less open ion channels, less depolarization of the muscle spindle neurons, less firing of action potentials, fewer action potentials, interpreted in my brain as in this position. So I can close my eyes and have a good sense of where my hand is. I can close my eyes and bring my fingertip right to my nose, even without seeing it, because I have good proprioception. I'm seeing it now, but now I'm not seeing it. I'll use my left hand, which is not as good. Pretty good. That's my nose. Because I know where my fingertip is, even without seeing it, because my brain has learned to interpret the information coming from my muscles of my own, not just my biceps, but my triceps and brachialis. All of those muscles are sending information to my brain as I'm going around, and I know okay, now I know I'm up, and now I know I'm down, and even if I weren't causing the movement, even if somebody else was moving my hand around, I would know where it is. That's proprioception. Now we have to transition from reception to the pathway to the brain. And this is information that I want you to know. So let's talk about the information from the free nerve endings, the cells of the somatosensory system that end in free nerve endings. So we're talking about a neuron that looks like this, sending its axon to the spinal cord. Okay? That's this axon right here. Its cell body is in the dorsal root ganglion. So this is a neuron that is detecting pain in my right hand, or my right toe, or the right side of my body, depending on which dermatome is being activated. Right side of the body, all of those cells have their cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion, but action potentials from the pain receptors enter the spinal cord in the dorsal horn. This area, this gray matter of the spinal cord is called the dorsal horn. So, this neuron, there's its cell body in the dorsal root ganglion, enters the spinal cord in the dorsal horn. And it makes a synapse there, an excitatory synapse there. So there's the location of the first synapse in the pain and temperature pathway is in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. I could quiz you on where the first synapse is because it shows that you've learned the pathway. I won't do it on quiz 2, but I could do it on quiz 3 or on an exam. Excitatory synapse. Now, the secondary neuron crosses over the spinal cord. The neuron crosses the midline, goes from right to left, if it's information from my right hand, or if it's information from my left hand, crosses from left to right, right? This is just showing information from the right side, but we're symmetric, we're bilaterally symmetric. We have pain information going from the left as well as from the right. The point is, in the pain and temperature pathway, the first synapse is in the dorsal horn, and the second neuron crosses over right there. It crosses over to the other side of the spinal cord, and its axon, now in white matter, goes up to the brain in a structure called the anterolateral column, or the anterolateral pathway. It's anterior and lateral. This cartoon doesn't do it justice. I'll show you more in another cartoon. Key concept. First synapse in the dorsal horn, crosses over right there. Second neuron, axon in the anterolateral column, where it makes a synapse in the thalamus. The thalamus is going to be a processing and relay station for all sensation, not just for somatosensation. So we have to talk about ipsilateral and contralateral now. Pain on the right side goes up the left anterolateral column. Pain on the left side goes up the right anterolateral column. In other words, pain and temperature cross in the spinal cord, and the pathway in the spinal cord is contralateral. It's on the side of the spinal cord opposite where the pain is. And it goes to the contralateral thalamus. And it's going to go to the contralateral somatosensory cortex. Now let's compare the touch and pressure pathway. Okay? Touch and pressure on my right hand. Cell body in the dorsal root ganglia. Enters the spinal cord in the dorsal horn. Does not make a synapse. Does not cross over yet. Its axon goes up to the brainstem. So the first synapse in the touch pressure pathway, is in the brainstem, the medulla. And it is on the ipsilateral side, because it has not crossed over yet. It crosses over in the brainstem and goes to the contralateral thalamus. So in both cases, we go to the contralateral thalamus. But in one case, the information is carried in the contralateral spinal cord, and in the touch pressure pathway, the information is carried in the ipsilateral spinal cord. Then it crosses over in the brainstem, and goes to the contralateral thalamus. And then it's going to go to the contralateral cerebral cortex, somatosensory cortex. I do want you to know that information.
Well,
Yeah.
so on the pain and temperature pathway, where are the cell bodies of the second neuron?
In the dorsal horn. That sphere is supposed to illustrate a cell body. So dendrites and cell bodies are there. In this case, the cell body is in the dorsal root ganglion. The dendrites are out in the periphery, out in the skin, and the terminals are here in the dorsal horn. But in the second neuron, that's where the cell body is of the second neuron, cell body and dendrites. And that's where the cell body is of the third neuron, in the thalamus. Okay?
Yeah.
First neuron, second neuron, third neuron. In the touch pressure pathway. This pathway, so we said in this one we crossed over and we go into the anterolateral section of the white matter of the spinal cord to go up. In this one, the neurons do not cross over. They go up in this dorsal column. That's what that's called, the dorsal column or the dorsal pathway. Dorsal, because this is anterior or ventral, and this is posterior or dorsal. So that's why this is called the dorsal horn. Dorsal horn, dorsal spinal cord, dorsal column. So let's cartoon this just a little better. So let's cartoon. Just help me out with this. Just want to do one thing. So let's take touch and pressure from the, let's go with the left hand first. Touch and pressure, so here's the dorsal root ganglion. Here is the neuron axon coming into the dorsal root ganglion, carrying touch and pressure information from the left side of the body. So let's do what I always do. Left, right. Keeping track of which is left and right. Anterior, or ventral, posterior, or dorsal. Okay, getting oriented. Information from the left side of the body enters the spinal cord. Where? What structure? It's the name of the structure where it enters the spinal cord.
Goes through the vertebra.
Well, it goes between, it enters between the vertebra. I'm not asking for the level because I didn't tell you whether it's finger. So left finger entering, okay, I have to look it up. Left finger. Finger is fingertip, left finger, let's say C7. So it's entering at the C7 level between these two vertebrae. That's not information that I would ask you to memorize. That's information that you could look up for a problem. But now what I do want you to memorize is that this neuron enters the dorsal horn. This is the touch pressure pathway. So does it form a synapse? I just screwed this up. It does not form a synapse. This neuron enters the white matter and this is the dorsal column. Now where does it go? Let's just say if this is left and this is right, this is front and this is back, the brain is that way. Right? We're looking down on somebody's spinal cord. The brain is that way. So this neuron now goes that way and makes a synapse in the brainstem over in LBC. On the ipsilateral side of the brainstem, and then the second neuron over in LBC is going to cross over. But this is ipsilateral. That is to say, here in the spinal cord, it's carrying ipsilateral information. Now let's talk about a pain or a temperature sensing neuron. That's not its cell body, sorry, that was a mistake. Axon, cell body in the dorsal root ganglion, enters the dorsal horn, makes a synapse on the secondary cell in the dorsal horn, which crosses over, enters the anterolateral pathway. Anterolateral pathway looks something like that. This is the anterolateral column. the second neuron enters the anterolateral column, and it goes to the brain. On the contralateral side. So now we see that touch pressure information is carried in the spinal cord on the ipsilateral side to the brain, and pain temperature information is carried in a different part of the spinal cord to the brain, on the contralateral side. And then synapses in the brain. So, ipsilateral, this is touch pressure, ipsilateral, no, this is touch pressure, ipsilateral, synapse in the brain, crossover, contralateral thalamus. This is pain temperature, crosses over in the spinal cord, goes up contralateral, anterolateral, stays contralateral for the rest of the pathway to the thalamus. Let's not worry about this. Do not worry about this collateral here. Not a key concept. Don't worry about this collateral either. Okay, and so the next slide has, so this is too much information right now. But here is the dorsal column, left and right. And here is the anterolateral column, left and right. This is, right now this is reference. So this is the area to understand here and here so far. Blue in this slide are sensory pathways, white matter tracks going to the brain. Red on this pathway are motor pathways coming from the brain to the muscles, which we're going to talk about next week. Or no, week after. Anyway. So this has the information, but it has too much information. I'm just putting it up here as a reference slide. This slide and your coloring of it, I think, are more useful at this point.
Bob,
Yeah.
is there any significance to the dorsal column left and right sides being right next to each other, like adjacent?
No.
No, okay.
No, there's really, I mean, there's good segregation. There's good segregation between the left and the right dorsal column, even though they're right next to each other.
Gotcha.
Now, you could imagine that it would be easy, so if in the case of spinal cord injury, it would be easy to damage both pathways here, but it would be more difficult to damage both pathways out here, but both happen. Nick?
And I think it was like about like people who they can't feel pain. Is that what on a physiological level is like wrong with?
So the question is, there are people who cannot feel pain, and there are two genetic mutations. This is rare, the more common genetic mutation is that the voltage-gated sodium channel subtype that is expressed in pain-sensing neurons. So there is a type of voltage-gated sodium channel that is expressed specifically in pain neurons. It's called NAB 1.7. Don't have to know that. There's a mutation in the gene for that channel. No voltage-gated sodium channels, no action potentials, no pain ever gets to the brain. You might think that that would be an advantageous mutation, but those people don't live very long. They put their hand on a hot stove and they just leave it there because it doesn't hurt until they realize, oh, I've just burned the hell out of my hand. And they still get infections, they still get burned, but they don't feel pain. babies with that mutation chew the hell, when they start to get teeth, chew the hell out of their tongue because it doesn't hurt. So people with that mutation typically, they don't live very long. They break their bones and they don't even know they've broken their bone. They burn their skin, they don't know it. So pain is a useful modality for survival. And those people don't survive very long, typically. There's another mutation in the brain that has to do with the cannabinoid receptor. There's another mutation of, I think I've only heard of one woman who has this mutation, where the same receptor that detects marijuana, cannabis, is hyperactive in this person's brain. She is basically high all the time, and she doesn't feel pain. That's extremely rare. The mutation in the sodium channels is rare, but not as rare. I think I answered that question. Yeah. It's an interesting phenomenon. In fact, this mutation is being, well, no, I'll get onto that later. I can get sidetracked here very much. Other questions? Okay, so use your cartoon, your drawing, to learn where these pathways are. You can refer to this, but this is dorsal column. I do not want you to know these details. I do not want you to know these details. And this is anterolateral column. I do not want you to know the details in here. This is left, and this is right. So this is ipsilateral to the left side, and this is contralateral to the left side, and vice versa. I think I've already talked about the dermatomes. So afferents from the shoulder and neck enter in the cervical level. Afferents from the hands and arms enter in the lower cervical level. Afferents are the nerves that carry information to the brain. That's afferents. That's language that I will use. I won't expect you to use it, but I will use it and expect you to understand what I'm talking about. Afferents are nerves that carry information to the brain. And then we're going to talk about efferents that carry information from the brain. So, afferents from the hands enter at C5. Afferents from the torso in the thoracic spinal cord. Afferents from the hips and legs in the lumbar region. Afferents from the heel and the genitals and enter at the sacral levels. I do not want you to memorize the levels, but I think it's safe for me to expect you to understand the broad strokes. Information from the chest and the back and the belly and the lower back is thoracic, enters in the T, some T level. Legs enters at some lumbar level. Arms and neck enters at some cervical level. So remember cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. Remember legs, torso, arms, and neck. But don't memorize numbers. Yeah.
Why is the heel so distinct? Like, why isn't it anything
Beats the hell out of me. I don't know. Okay, so I want to go back a few slides. So information, this is from the right side. Information from the right side, both pain and temperature and touch and pressure, end up in the contralateral thalamus, processing in the contralateral thalamus, and is now going to go to the contralateral somatosensory cortex. And now the concept that I want to introduce is that there is a map of the body on the somatosensory cortex. So here is the post-central gyrus, sort of in a oblique coronal section. So front, back, right, left in this perspective. This is the right, right post-central gyrus, the right somatosensory cortex. Now we're looking at it in a coronal section. So here is the longitudinal fissure. Here is the lateral sulcus. There's the temporal lobe, right hemisphere, the right side. This is the gray matter of the right post-central gyrus. And there is a map of the body on that gray matter. So the face and the mouth from that lateral. Fingers and hand, superior lateral. Arm and torso, superior. Legs and toes, medium. Genitals, deep medium. So a map of the body on the somatosensory cortex, and it's a modified map. The face, well, the mouth especially, the face, the mouth and the jaw take up a big section of cortex because it's such important information. So a lot of the cortex is processing information from the lower face. The same section, the same amount of cortex that handles, let's just say this amount of cortex that handles just the lower face, handles the entire leg because it's just less critical information. So that's why and the hand is somewhere in between. So this body has a name. It's called the homunculus, and it's a highly distorted map of the body on the somatosensory cortex, with the hands and the lower face taking up large amounts of neural processing information in the gray matter, and toes and leg taking up less. I do want you to know this map. Face lateral, hands superior lateral, arms, torso superior, legs, genitals medial. Yeah.
Is there a reason evolutionarily why the lower part of our face is so sensitive? Because I thought it was internal, but there's a whole other section for the tongue.
Yeah.
So this is only like external, right?
This is lips, jaw. There's a whole other section just for the tongue.
Is there a reason why that's so on it?
It probably has something to do with language. That in order to control our mouth accurately, we have to have a good sense of sensation, especially proprioception, of where the muscles are in our lips and mouth. I'm guessing. I have to admit, I'm speculating. I think that this and this are so large in humans because of language. We're very good. We've learned how to control our mouth very carefully. That's motor. But in order to have good motor control, we need good sensory input. That's what I think. We've evolved good sensation in our fingers because we're so good at manipulating things with our fingers now. We need to have good motor control, and we need to have good sensory feedback information. Same idea. Okay. let's take a short break now. Just move around, take a rest, and we'll move on to the next section of the course.